Okay, so we're back on the second part, and this is the part about the Normans. The Normans, as you recall, were Vikings who settled into the area of France's Normandy as a result of a deal cut between Rollo and the king, and the Rollo and the King of France, Charles the Fair, or Simple, Charles the Simple. I think that the Normans really take off in France, and they're a very successful society. But we're still in this medieval warming period, right? And the Normans in France are still growing in population. And they have a limited area that they can deal with. Now they can marry into French families, and they do, and establish themselves as French nobility. Well, one of the things about France is that it's not a oldest son takes all system of inheritance as it is in England. In France, the estate is divided amongst the younger sons, uh, between each younger son, so the estates get smaller and smaller if you have more sons. So there's more land pressure on the Normans, and the big families start going places. In 1016, a group of Norman pilgrims uh, move into the port of Apulia in southern Italy. Now, they're returning from Jerusalem, right? And so Jerusalem and the Crusades, the Arabs have Jerusalem open to travel, and the Normans and the Christians are making these regular crusades, right? So these crusaders are in the port of Apulia in Italy, and uh, they are unarmed, they're weaponless. They are pilgrims, right? So they're coming back. Well, the Muslims, especially in the Emirate of Sicily and other places, are also raiders. Like the Vikings, the Muslims have people that sail aside and raid the Christian towns and take tribute and soldiers, right? In this case, Apulia was attacked by a Muslim raiding force. Now, the legend is that these 10 Norman soldiers, and there were, legendarily 10 of them, they ride out. They say, "Hey, give us some horses, give us some armor." When the Muslims show up, the people in the city are like, "Oh, the Muslims are coming. Oh, we've got to surrender. We've got to hide the children, and we got to figure out what tribute they want because this had been customary, right?" The Italians, these small Italian city states, didn't really have the ability to resist the power of the didn't have the Muslims. So these Normans, they see all these people cowardless, and they borrow armor and horses, and they ride out, supposedly 10 of them, and they defeat hundreds of Muslims, right? Because the Normans have this, legendary fierceness, right? Um, these Normans then go back to Normandy, and they say, "Hey, man, there's this place down there in Italy where the guys don't know how to fight, and you could make a lot of money fighting." And at the time, the kingdom of Lombardy, right, was the dominant force in Italy. And here's Lombardy up here. But the Lombard power included Tuscany and Spoleto. The Pope ruled Rome, but he had a problem with the local Lombard lords, and of course the Lombards wanted to conquer Benevento, Capua, Amalfi, and then there were the Byzantine empires surrounding Salerno, right? So Italy is really split up and divided at the time. There's no real power there. So the Normans, with their battlefield prowess shown in Apulia, suddenly become hot commodities, right? And a lot of Normans started coming to Italy to enlist as mercenaries to fight against the Normans or against the Lombards and get settled. Um, the most influential are five de Hauteville brothers, right? Who carved out duchies and princedoms in southern Italy, right? So the de Hauteville brothers show up and they start conquering the lands in southern Italy, right? They start making Salerno a principality, right? They conquer Benevento, they conquer Capua, and they really move and kick the people. The Byzantines ultimately get pushed out of the Byzantine Empire, gets pushed out of southern Italy, and they are dominating southern Italy. The youngest of them, Robert, called Guiscard, was looking over at Sicily and saying, "Well, we've settled in Sicily," and ultimately we settled in southern Italy, and Robert Guiscard goes over and conquers Sicily and becomes, king of Sicily. And the kingdom of Sicily will rise to power because ultimately one of its monarchs, by virtue of marriage, will become Holy Frederick II, will become Holy Roman Emperor. But that's kind of a later story, right? After a battle with the Lombards, what happens is the Normans ultimately capture the Pope, right? And the Normans are really Catholic, right? They're very much part of the Holy Father. And so when they find themselves in control of the Pope, they're like, "Oh, Holy Father," they cut a deal. Essentially, what they promise is that will the Pope will legitimize their conquests, right? Because the Pope has the power to say, "Oh, you so and so person are ordained by God as a king," right? This goes back to Charlemagne, right? The popes have this power. In exchange, they pledge loyalty and service to the Pope. And here we see, the moment where the Pope is, and his cardinals are crowning one of the de Hauteville brothers and their knights. This is later than contemporary, but it's a retelling of that story. And the Pope crowns them king. When Robert Guiscard takes over Sicily, he has it where not just is, the Pope is crowning him, right? But really through the Pope, it's Christ. And so this is a mosaic from a temple in Italy showing Christ crowning Robert Guiscard as king of Sicily. So the Normans, not the Romans, sorry. So the Normans really adopt this idea of religion and faith as legitimizing their rule, and they sort of are the ones who turn knighthood, as a result of the capture of the Pope. Knighthood goes from being, it's a bunch of soldiers on horses, to a social and religious construct, right? The idea of the knight as a warrior ordained by God really sort of cements in the notion of the Pope. So knighthood obtains a religious status, right? Pope. So knighthood obtains a religious status, right? This is important because when we see sort of the Normans kind of converting into the kingdom of Sicily, and here it is in 1154, right? So the de Hauteville brothers unite their kingdom into one sort of kingdom under Sicily, under Robert Guiscard, right? So suddenly the Normans are a force. At this point, this is when the Pope is starting to talk about the Crusades, right? The wars amongst the Christian princes in Europe are troubling to the Pope, and the Pope wants to assert his power. And so one of the thoughts is he can use this religious force, this religious obligation of warriors for Christ, to push on a crusade. So by 1099, right, the First Crusade, this is 100 years after the conquest, or less than 100 years after the conquest of Italy, right? We are going on crusade. The army that conquers Jerusalem in 1099 is largely composed of Normans, whether they're French Normans or Italian Normans, right? There's the nobles are largely Norman. They do bring on troops from other, troops or knights or warriors from all over Christendom, but the Norman impact is huge. So important it is that to the Byzantines, right, they called all the Western warriors Franks from France, right? But really, what they mean, the term Frank really becomes synonymous with Normans. It's not just the French that are pushing on the crusade, but it's the Normans, right? And, you will draw in people from the Norman influence. In addition to kind of the Norman warrior knighthood influence, right? We see the Normans influencing castle building, right? The Normans really start this idea of stone and wood keeps and fortifications. They stamp their influence on conquered territories. The Normans bring in this idea of a Norman French monarchy and government. They superimpose themselves onto local rulers. So both in Italy and ultimately, as we will see in England, the Normans become a ruling class over local classes. They sort of merge into these ideas. Also, Norman architecture, Norman chapels, Norman stone churches become a big deal. So sort of this Norman expansion is kind of a cultural revolution, right? It's a cultural revolution both in terms of warfare, it's a cultural revolution in terms of religion, and through contacts with, with the Muslims in Sicily. At one point, the king of Sicily's bodyguard are Muslims because he doesn't trust the other Christian nobles, right? The Normans bring a cultural exchange too. So a lot of the Norman ideas of government and order get imposed on the rest of Europe as well. So there's kind of a little Norman revolution. Of course, the most famous Norman raid is probably the last great Viking raid, and it is what is called the Norman Conquest of 1066, right? And this really results in the intermarriage of Vikings, Normans, and Saxons, right? So all of these groups, the Danes, the Viking Danes, Norman nobles, and Saxon chiefs and nobles, all are sort of intermarried, and there's kind of a cross North Sea set of familial relations that is pretty intricate and complex. Edward the Confessor, who is the last Saxon king of England, dies with no clear heir. And because of relations between these three cultures, there are three competing claimants. William of Normandy is a cousin of Edward the Confessor, and he spends a lot of time, Duke William of Normandy, he spends some time in England, and he elicits a promise from Edward the Confessor to make William his heir. Now, the Bayeux Tapestry, which I think your book talks about and tells you about, the Bayeux Tapestry shows this oath being taken on oaths being taken, and William is no dummy. He looks at Harold Godwinson, another claimant to the throne. Harold Godwinson is in England. He's the Saxon guy on the site who's in charge, and he makes Harold Godwinson promise to not claim the throne. And then another one, a Viking guy, the last major Viking king of Denmark, right? Harald Hardrada, who had been a member of the Varangian Guard, right, and is a great Viking chief. He gets behind the claim of Harold Godwinson's brother Tostig, and as a cousin or a relation, and so he also sees Tostig as a way of claiming the throne of England. Well, when Edward dies, the Normans are, everybody is divided over who does it, and people start moving. Edward dies, and Harold Godwinson asserts his right because he is running England. He is there. He asserts his right to the throne. William says, "Oh, I'm king now," and he gets his army together. And Tostig and Harold Hardrada get their armies together. And in 1066, it all comes to a head. Stamford Bridge is fought on September 25th of 1066, and Hardrada and Tostig lead their invasion. They arrive first in England, right? So Harold Godwinson marches up to fight Hardrada and wins the battle at Stamford Bridge. Hardrada dies, Tostig dies, and that claim ends, right? So Godwinson is able to win that battle. But at the same time he's fighting that battle, William the Conqueror is landing on the southern coast of England at Hastings. And so Hardrada has to march, or not Hardrada, Harold Godwinson has to march his army a couple hundred miles to the south in, as you can see, in a number of weeks, in a couple of weeks, actually really days, in which William the Conqueror, sort of to fight William at Hastings. They fight a battle at Hastings, and it's really sort of a military triumph. The armies at Stamford Bridge were relatively similar to each other. They were warriors fighting mostly in infantry behind a shield wall. At Hastings, the Normans have a significant amount of cavalry against kind of a Saxon shield wall, and it's really sort of the Normans' tactical mobility and ability to sort of retreat and maneuver that gains William the day, right? So William takes the day, Harold Godwinson is killed, and William then becomes King of England. And he establishes a dynasty that will rule England until almost 1500, right? So he's kind of the first of this William this dynasty that rules England. He's the founder. Well, the first thing William does is he changes the whole idea, right? The reason I call this a Viking raid is William lands in England and he wins the battle. And then he spends a couple years, sort of putting down resistance and establishing and consolidating his power. But ultimately, William says, hey, all of England is mine. I have taken it. It is my treasure. And he claims it all for himself, thus kind of centralizing himself as a monarch. Then he looks at all of his friends who helped him, all of his nobles and all of his Norman buddies who helped him, and he says, I'm going to give you land. You are going to take land through me, and you will pay me tribute for this land, but, I am the one who is giving you the land. So he allocates the land between his Norman followers, and he makes critical Saxon allies. So you have a ruling class that is both Norman and Saxon. Obviously, the lion's share goes to the Normans, but he doesn't discount the Saxon nobility, and he doesn't take away as both a Viking and a Norman, he doesn't take away the role of the peasants on the bottom, right? In other words, he doesn't make them serfs and tie them to the land. He makes the English peasants yeomen, right? They are free men at the bottom who are kind of the lowest form of warriors, but they are a Viking society as much as they are sort of a Charlemagne society, right? Remember, in France, Charlemagne creates the idea of serfs, and serfs are tied to the land and they owe service to the noble. The yeoman in England is a free farmer, right? And that's born out of this idea of, at the bottom end of the Viking raid, the average guy carrying an axe owed loyalty to the chief, but he was still a free man with an axe. And England sort of adopts that, right? The other thing that William does in England is he makes an accounting. You can see here in this picture, right? Okay, the upper picture is the Norman cavalry, and here you have the Saxons on foot, and this is sort of showing the triumph of the Norman cavalry over the Saxons. You can see the Normans also use a lot of archers, so they have a real mixed force. Then this here is the Domesday Book, right? William orders an accounting of everything in England that is his. Right? So he goes through and he basically conquers England and he takes an inventory. And the Domesday Book is the inventory of everything in England, right? How many villages there are, how many slaves they have, how many smiths they have, how many bakeries there are, how many cows they have, right? I mean, it is a big, long inventory of all the things that William has taken in his raid on England. And it shows how he distributes them. But ultimately, what becomes important about William's kingship versus just his conquest is that we really see a centralized crown. And even to this day in England, most property is not owned in the sense that we own it in America, where it's your land and you can do what you want with it. Most property is purchased as 999-year leases from the Queen, right? So the Queen owns the land, but you buy a 1,000-year lease, which is basically like owning it, and then you trade this 1,000-year lease, which renews every time you do it. So you're really, your land is taken from the Queen. So this is really kind of the Norman, there we are. This is kind of the Norman Revolution and the Viking Revolution, right? The Vikings really enter into Europe and they transform it. And as the Normans, they complete this transformation, and Europe will increasingly start looking more and more Norman as the Normans marry into the important families, and really ideas about knighthood and religion all really start being transformed by the Normans. Anyway, so that ends this lecture. I think I've put the assignment up, or will have put the assignment up by the time I put the lecture up, so that you can go through and answer the question. I can tell you that your question is probably going to be on page 264. You're going to answer question 2 about what you see in the Bayeux Tapestry. And I will put a link to the whole Bayeux Tapestry because it's worth taking a look at. Anyway, thanks for listening, and here we go. This is the new era. We're going to see how this works.